The town of Black Hollow had always warned of the abandoned Saintsville Asylum. Once a home for the criminally insane, it had long since fallen into decay, its halls empty, except for those who never left. Locals swore they saw figures moving past the shattered windows at night, heard distant screams carried on the wind, and felt an unbearable weight of sorrow whenever they passed by. For Daniel, a paranormal investigator seeking proof of the afterlife, it was the perfect challenge. Armed with cameras, an EVP recorder, and an iron will, he stepped through the rusted gates, past the weathered sign that still read Saintsville Asylum in peeling letters. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It was heavy, suffocating. A stench of mildew and something coppery, like old blood, lingered in the air. The faint echoes of footsteps not his own whispered through the corridors. He set up his equipment in what used to be the main ward, a vast room with overturned gurneys and decayed furniture. The walls were lined with rusted shackles, remnants of the brutal treatments once performed here. He pressed record and spoke, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at his chest. "Is there anyone here who wants to speak?" Silence. Then, static. A faint crackling in his earpiece. He adjusted the frequency, listening carefully. A whisper slipped through the interference. "Leave." Daniel's breath hitched. His hands trembled slightly as he played it back. The whisper was unmistakable, but he refused to back down. Instead, he moved deeper into the asylum, his flashlight flickering in the suffocating darkness. A rusted wheelchair stood in the center of a hallway facing him. It hadn't been there a moment ago. The temperature plummeted. His breath became visible, curling in the frozen air. The hairs on his arms stood up. Then the chair moved. It rolled slowly toward him, the wheels squeaking, leaving faint trails in the dust. His pulse thundered, but he held his ground, raising his camera. Through the lens, the hallway was no longer empty. A figure loomed at the end of the corridor. A patient's gown, stained and torn, clung to a skeletal frame. Hollow eyes stared at him from sunken sockets, and a grin stretched across its gaunt face. Unnatural, far too wide. Then it ran. Daniel barely had time to react before the thing was upon him, a blur of movement and inhuman speed. The camera crashed to the floor, static filling its screen. His body locked up, his limbs frozen as ice-cold fingers brushed against his throat. A deafening shriek erupted in his ears, a sound not of this world. His vision blurred as pain split through his skull, an unbearable pressure invading his mind. Shadows swirled around him, whispering, screaming, consuming him. With every ounce of strength he had left, he stumbled back, gasping. As suddenly as it had begun, the presence lifted. The hallway was empty once more. The wheelchair lay on its side, unmoving. Shaking, he grabbed his camera and bolted. The asylum howled behind him, the voices of the damned echoing in the wind. As he reached the rusted gates, a final whisper caressed his ear, sending ice through his veins. "See you soon." That was the last time anyone had ever heard from Daniel. The old Holloway Manor had always been the subject of dark whispers in the small town of Ravenswood. No one lived there, not since the Holloway family had vanished without a trace over a century ago. Some said the house was cursed. Others believed it was simply abandoned, left to rot with time. But those who had dared to enter spoke of strange shadows, whispers in the dark, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Ethan, a skeptic by nature, scoffed at the legends. A journalist seeking his next big story, he saw the manor as nothing more than a dilapidated building with a grim past. With his camera, flashlight, and recorder in hand, he decided to spend the night inside, determined to prove that ghosts were nothing more than figments of imagination. As the heavy oak door creaked open, an icy breeze rushed past him, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and decay. The grand foyer stretched before him, the chandelier above swaying slightly, though there was no wind. He muttered to himself about the draftiness of old houses and stepped inside. The first few hours passed uneventfully. He explored room after room, noting the dust-covered furniture, tattered wallpaper, and eerie silence. It was almost disappointingly mundane. Then, as he entered what appeared to be a study, his flashlight flickered. The air grew colder, thick with an unseen presence. The recorder in his pocket crackled to life, a faint whisper slithering through the static. "Leave." Ethan froze. The rational part of his mind insisted it was interference, but a deep unease settled in his chest. He turned to leave the room when the door slammed shut behind him. His breath hitched. He pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A chill spread across his spine as he heard the slow, deliberate creak of the wooden floorboards behind him. He wasn't alone. Whirling around, his flashlight beam trembled over the room. At first, there was nothing. Then, the shadows began to shift. A figure emerged from the darkness, a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman in a tattered Victorian gown. Her face was contorted in anguish, her lips moving soundlessly. Ethan stumbled backward, heart hammering. The woman's mouth opened wider and wider, a gaping black void, as an ear-piercing shriek erupted from her. The walls trembled, the furniture rattled, and unseen hands clawed at Ethan's arms. Panicked, he pounded on the door. "Let me out!" The whispering voices turned to screams, a cacophony of agony and rage. Just as he felt his vision blur, the door flew open. Ethan tumbled into the hallway, gasping. He didn't stop running until he was outside, the cold night air shocking his senses. He turned back once, just in time to see the figure standing in the doorway. Her hollow eyes bore into him, her silent lips forming two unmistakable words: "You're next." The Holloway Manor had claimed another victim, and this time, it wasn't finished. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you back for another terrifying horror story.